Before I begin today's episode, I want to briefly describe what happened for listeners who may not have heard about the event. Today, I'm going to share about a disastrous event, a traumatic event that led to collective grief. I also want you to be aware that if whatever you hear might be triggering, please take your time, maybe take a pause, or even stop listening. It was the early hours of January 1st in Crans-Montana, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. The new year had just begun, and the bar, Constellation, was filled with people celebrating, friends, families, seasonal workers, and visitors. According to those who were there, the atmosphere was lively and joyful, the way you would expect it on a night like that, celebrating into the new year. Then, without warning, a part of the structural ceiling caught fire. People described feeling something shifting before they understood what was happening. As the ceiling began to illuminate, it quickly took over the whole room, and people had to flee this inferno. Emergency services arrived quickly, and those nearby tried to help one another while the situation unfolded. In the hours that followed, it became clear that the incident had led to multiple injuries and several lives lost. For the people who witnessed it, for families awaiting news, for the local community, and for many watching from afar, the event brought shock, confusion, and a profound sadness. The days that followed were filled with questions and support efforts, and a collective attempt to understand and process what had occurred. This episode is dedicated to everyone affected, directly or indirectly, as we explore the emotional and psychological impact that follows a sudden tragedy like this.
Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Nathalie. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Nathalie. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Nathalie's website, join the podcast's Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes.
Welcome back to another episode of How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. I'm your host, Nathalie Himmelrich. Today's episode addresses a tragedy that has touched many hearts across Switzerland and far beyond. A devastating event that took place on January 1st in Crans-Montana at a bar called Constellation. A place of celebration became the site of immense loss, injury, fear, and shock. Communities, local, national, and international, are still grappling with the emotional aftermath. So in this episode, it's not about exactly what happened, and I have no intention to traumatize you, but I will walk you through what happens in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, and how grief and trauma unfolds individually and collectively. I'm also going to highlight how such an event affects local communities and the wider world, and I'll share the common emotional, cognitive, and somatic reactions. We're going to look at the impact of media, legal processes, and the uncertainty. I will highlight what people might expect in the coming weeks and months, how to support yourself and others after such a tragic event, how communities can heal, and why tragedies like this ripple through the global collective. So with this episode, I intend to give validation, context, and tools to anyone affected, directly or indirectly, by an intense trauma such as this. So Crans-Montana is just an example. So the first part is about the immediate aftermath of tragedy. So when a disaster like this occurs suddenly, like this extreme fire, the immediate aftermath follows a predictable yet deeply destabilizing pattern. The first area is the shock and survival mode. So in the first minutes or hours, the nervous system responds with fight, flight, freeze, or collapse responses. There is adrenaline surging, which can lead to numbness or dissociation, confusion or disorientation, and the nervous system becomes narrowly focused on survival and basic safety. This response is not cognitive, it's physiological. It's the body takes over. So be aware of that when you're reading news after a traumatic event such as this, because there's often blame attached to people's natural response based on survival and looking for basic safety. As I said, this response is not cognitive, it's physiological. It is something that the body has to do without the conscious mind being involved. That is the work of the autonomic nervous system, which is subconscious. The next part is chaos and information gaps will occur. So people present at the scene, like first responders and community members, experience fragmented information. They are unclear about injury or death status, which is deeply destabilizing. They will find difficult to reach loved ones. There's also the traffic of the emergency service and the sounds that can be quite triggering and shocking. And there's always a rapid spread of rumors and speculations. So be aware that information will be contradictory, incomplete, and constantly shifting. The third part is there will be heightened emotional states. It is normal that the body goes through distress and competing emotional states arise simultaneously, such as panic, helplessness, hope, fear, desperation, or denial. Like families desperately call hospitals, police, and friends, trying to find their loved ones, people present, re-experience moments repeatedly, and say the same thing again and again. The next part is, it's called the disruption of time. So it's interesting because many survivors describe time slowing down or everything happening at once. This is a trauma-specific effect of the brain losing its normal temporal sequencing. So all the reactions mentioned so far are normal and expected given the circumstances. So part 2. How does such an event affect the local and the wider community? The impact of a disaster like this is never contained to the people physically present. It spreads locally, so local residents experience loss of sense of safety, fear of public spaces, collective shock, a disruption of daily routines. They might feel emotional exhaustion. There's obviously a heightened media presence in their environment, which adds to the stress. And a common sense or cultural sense or community sense of this happened to us, which can often lead to community grief rituals. In the last 12 days, we've seen different of those community rituals, such as the most recent day of mourning that we had in Switzerland, the mourning rituals being distributed into churches or the church bells ringing. And the town might become like a place of pilgrimage or mourning and investigation. So local businesses feel the emotional atmosphere and foot traffic shifts, and residents may avoid certain areas for weeks or even months. The wider community is also impacted. Even those living far away may experience such as fear, especially if they visited or known someone connected there. There might also be a reactivation of past trauma, related traumas or triggers that are being relived through what has happened in the present moment. The wider community might also be impacted by a sense of global instability or human identification with vulnerability. And this is because humans are wired for relational thinking, like if it happened to them, it could happen to me or someone I love. So in my case, a lot of people from around the world, people that I know, have heard about it and have asked me about it. So it has spread to wide areas, wider communities than I can even think of. So part 3, I want to share some common grief and trauma responses after disasters such as this. So these responses arise in waves and they often overlap. So I'm going to go through the emotional, cognitive, the physical somatic, and the behavioral responses. And you can also find them on my website and in the show notes. So emotional responses could be shock, intense sadness, fear or panic, anger, helplessness, guilt, such as survivor guilt, parent guilt, how could I have let my child go there, or could I have prevented this, or numbness. Cognitive responses could be disbelief, like this cannot be real, or like it's like I'm an actor in a show and it's going to stop any moment. Then confusion or intrusive thoughts or images, difficulty concentrating and replaying the event. There's often also like a trauma vortex that draws people again and again to the news, searching for what might have changed in the last few days. Then some physical or somatic responses are sleep disturbances, change in appetite, hypervigilance, heart palpitation, shakiness, or increased startle responses, and exhaustion. Behavioral responses of those local, avoidance of the location, or even being drawn to see what's happening, like as I said, the trauma vortex, or withdrawal. There might also be increased alcohol or substance use. People might have difficulty returning to routines, or as I said before, might overconsume media news. All of these are consistent with acute trauma. Part 4, what has been happening since the event? So let's have a look at collective reactions and emotional waves. So it's been 12 days, and in the weeks following such a tragedy, we observe specific patterns. So the first one, as I mentioned before, is like shock and disbelief. Communities often say things such as, this cannot be happening, or I saw these people last week. It feels surreal. And then a big part is the collective grief. And you can find out more about collective grief also in episode 118. So collective grief is shown by vigils, candles, flowers being laid, or community gathering emerging, often spontaneously. And these rituals are really important and help people feel connected and not alone. Then also anger and blame rises. So as the shock falls, there might be anger. Anger at the event, anger at perceived causes, anger at authority who missed part of their duties, maybe even anger at God or fate, or anger at randomness. And blame is a psychological attempt to restore a sense of safety and control. So the thought behind that is that if we can locate the cause, then the world is predictable again. Because for the brain, there is nothing worse than the world being unpredictable or uncontrollable. Another pattern is the one of questioning. So people search for meaning. They ask, how could this happen? Who is responsible? What went wrong? Why them? And this questioning is not pathological. It's an attempt to rebuild a coherent reality. As I said before, it's the mind's way to make sense and to restore order. And then, of course, polarization. Sadly, tragic events can sometimes divide communities through differing narratives, interpretation, or coping styles. All of these responses are normal. So let's have a look in part 5 at the impact of uncertainty and not knowing. Because one of the most traumatic aspects of sudden disasters is the period of prolonged uncertainty. For example, families waiting for news. So not knowing whether a loved one is dead, missing, or injured, that generates an extreme stress, which shows in like a pendulum swing between hope and fear, or mental rehearsing of worst-case scenarios, They might experience difficulty sleeping or eating or feel emotionally paralyzed. And part of that is an inability to grieve because there is no confirmation. And this state is called ambiguous loss, which I've also covered in Understanding Grief and Loss terminologies. You can find it in the show notes or in the overview over the episodes. And it is one of the most painful human experiences because the mind cannot anchor itself. Ambiguous loss can lead to delayed grief, prolonged grief, trauma symptoms, and long-term psychological instability if not supported. Go and check out this series on understanding grief and trauma terminologies for more information on those terms. An important part is the role of media in disaster, like grief and trauma, because media coverage has a dual impact. So some of the helpful aspects are the dissemination of information or coordination of support efforts. They help public awareness and communal solidarity. But some of the harmful aspects are we are repeatedly exposed to graphic images, and obviously the media covers things that are sensational. They might be intrusive to interview families, to generate something new of sensation. Also, speculations are portrayed as facts, and sometimes people feel the pressure to perform grief. And there's endless reactivation of trauma through headlines. And as I said before, which I call the trauma vortex, which also always draws people back, it's people find themselves unable to look away, even though the constant exposure worsens distress. So limiting media consumption is a key trauma recovery strategy. For example, I remember after the tsunami hit in Thailand, I was glued to television, and as a response to that, I stopped watching television altogether because I understood the impact of this intense media consumption and the traumatization that it had on me. Part 7, and important, is the impact of legal and forensic processes as part of a disaster. Because after a disaster, legal, forensic, and investigative processes begin. And while they're necessary, they can complicate grief. Such processes can delay clarity, so families may wait weeks for official confirmation, for autopsy results or cause of death report. In the case of Crans-Montana, the victims, 40 victims, died at this moment. They died from severe burns. Then re-traumatization, because forensic description, reconstructions, and publicized details may trigger trauma responses, and often do. And then there's anger and frustration because legal processes move slowly, and families often feel powerless, forgotten, disrespected, and overwhelmed. There's often conflict because different groups may blame different parties. Legal complexity often deepens the communal division. And there's public scrutiny, so families may often feel exposed or judged. In the sum of it, legal clarity does not equal emotional closure. So in part 8, I was asking myself, why and how do such disasters affect the whole world? Events such as this ripple globally for several reasons. First of all, it's because we have a shared human vulnerability. People everywhere recognize themselves in the victims. Like friends gathering on New Year's, a night out, a holiday. We know those situations. It's also a tourist destination. People may know the mountains, the Alps. They might even have visited Crans-Montana or know someone who has. Because we have the global media, we can get news within minutes. News crosses borders faster than any other time in history before that. Another reason is our nervous system resonates. So humans correlate emotionally, and trauma witnessed can evoke trauma felt. And then there's also interesting collective grief patterns. So in a world with ongoing crises, such as wars, tragedies, and instability. Each new tragedy compounds existing emotional fatigue. And so this is why people far beyond Switzerland felt shaken by this event. In the next part, let's have a look at what to expect in the coming weeks and months. This section applies to whether you belong to the survivors, family of victims, local residents, the wider community, or if you in any way feel triggered by this event because it might have reactivated some trauma within you. So first, the shock will fall. You can expect that around week 3 to 6, emotions become more intense as numbness decreases. So we're about 2 weeks in, so that's the next stage to come. Next is also trauma symptoms may increase temporarily. They might come as nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, a feeling like, what's the next shoe that drops? And quite normal is that it might be difficult returning to normal because routines may feel pointless or triggering. The next part is anniversary reactions. So this is not just the yearly anniversary, that could be monthly markers, the 1 month point, the 6 month point, the 1 year anniversary, and they often bring renewed pain. Another one is the desire for answers. Families want clarity, responsibility, and narrative coherence. In terms of the long-term community effects, some people may relocate or avoid the location or developing ongoing fear responses in relation to certain events or certain situations. All of these effects are normal and are recoverable with the right kind of support. So in the next part, we're looking at how you can support yourself after a disaster. So here are some evidence-formed strategies. First and most important is to stabilize the body, because trauma healing begins physiologically. Sleep, very important to have enough sleep, grounding, breath work and movement. There's a lot of somatic-based, trauma-informed care work, which I can highly recommend. The next is reduce media intake, if at all, once per day from a reliable source, or even filtered from a friend or support person. The next one is to seek relational anchors. Talk to those you trust, because trauma isolates and connection heals. Another one is to give the experience a narrative. This could be done through writing, drawing, speaking, using metaphors, and this can support integration. And honoring your individual pace, because there is no universal timeline, not one that fits everyone. Next one is to engage in community, but avoid overwhelm. So choose the rituals that feel supportive to you. And last but not least, seek professional support. Early trauma therapy can prevent long-term impacts. In fact, the Somatic Experience community has created a page, a website for support, and is supporting those affected by the trauma. The link will be shared in the show notes. Part 11 is about supporting others. There's a whole section on my website on supporting others in general, but in terms of a traumatic disaster, there's just a couple of important things. 1, use simple, validating language. 2, check in regularly. 3, offer practical help. And 4, avoid explanations, comparison, or solutions. Part 12, I was wondering about long-term healing and meaning making and community recovery. What can we look for? So over time, communities after such a disaster, individuals begin to rebuild. There's often a need for advocacy, for safety reforms, for collective rituals or storytelling, memorials even, reclaiming public spaces, supporting each other. And important is to know that meaning making is a slow, nonlinear process. There is no pressure to find the good or move on. Sometimes there is no finding the good or moving on. But healing is about weaving the loss into the ongoing story of life. Remember, this is looking far ahead. This might make no sense to you, so let this part go if it is not speaking to you. And in the last part, I was asking myself, so why a tragedy like this gains sudden worldwide attention even while wars continue in places such as Gaza and Ukraine. And one of the striking psychological and sociological dynamics following disasters, such as this tragedy in Crans-Montana as an example, is how they can suddenly command global attention. Even while large-scale crises such as the wars in Gaza and Ukraine at this moment continue to unfold daily, causing immense ongoing suffering. So understanding why this happened helps us validate our reactions and understanding the nature of collective grief and global empathy. Human beings respond more intensely to sudden, contained, and relatable events. So unlike war, long, complex, politically loaded, and ongoing, a sudden disaster is acute and time-bound. It's visually and narratively clear, it's emotionally relatable, and easy to imagine happening to oneself or a loved one. So people anywhere in the world can picture themselves in a bar on New Year's Eve. And this emotional proximity makes the event hit harder. And the sudden loss breaks through psychological numbing, because continuous exposure to war, crisis, and suffering, especially over months and years, that creates an emotional fatigue or numbness, which is a psychological defense mechanism. And the suddenness of this event, this disrupts that numbness. It's like it pierces through the protective layer people develop to cope with ongoing global suffering. Another important point is the "this could have been me" mechanism. So mass tragedies in civilian spaces activate identification much more readily than geopolitical conflicts. People say, for example, "I was at a similar event last week," or "I was in that bar just last year," or "my children go out to places like this." And this sense of proximity and randomness triggers a powerful empathetic response. The next point is that disasters lack political polarization. So wars tend to divide global audiences along political, ideological, or cultural lines. And people may not know how to engage without feeling overwhelmed, conflicted, or helpless. In contrast, a sudden tragedy such as the one at Constellation, it has no sides, and it requires no political analysis. It invites direct emotional connection and feels tragically straightforward. People were harmed who should have been safe. This makes collectively empathy easier, less fraught, and less morally complex. And, sadly, but the media ecosystem favors sudden dramatic events. As we've seen before, media organizations prioritize immediacy, novelty, visual impact, and emotional resonance. So war becomes background news because they persist for months or years. And a sudden disaster, however, offers a new narrative spike, like a sensation. This does not mean that the event matters more, just that it fits the media logic more neatly. Another point is the psychological bandwidth and emotional contrast. So humans cannot stay emotionally activated by chronic tragedy indefinitely. So when something sudden or shocking occurs, it stands out from the ongoing noise. And the contrast between celebration and disaster, or life and death, or light and dark, amplifies attention. And a global community is hungry for shared humanity. In an era of global fragmentation, disasters paradoxically create temporal global unity. So people everywhere express solidarity, sorrow, and recognition. And this shared emotional response becomes a form of collective coherence, a brief moment where humanity feels aligned. And very important, this does not diminish ongoing suffering elsewhere. The global attention turns towards a sudden tragedy does not imply that people care less about Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Venezuela, or any other region experiencing prolonged crisis. Rather, Sudden events cut through emotional exhaustion. Humans have limited capacity to hold multiple traumas simultaneously. And discrete tragedies allow people to feel compassion without being overwhelmed. And grief is not a zero-sum resource. Understanding this helps us hold both truths at once. One, that the Cromon tragedy deserves compassion and attention, and two, ongoing global suffering deserves continued awareness and support. One does not negate the other. So what does this teach us about grief on a global scale? Events like this show us that humans instinctively respond to sudden vulnerability, that our collective nervous system reacts similarly to individual trauma, and that grief expands beyond borders because trauma resonates universally. In this sense, the world's reaction is not only about the event itself, it's about our shared humanity being reminded of its fragility. So disasters like the one in Cromon leave profound marks on individuals, families, communities, and the global collective. But they also reveal the depth of our human interconnectedness. If you were affected directly or indirectly, please know your reactions are normal, your pain is valid, healing is possible. For those seeking deeper understanding of trauma and collective grief, there's many episodes, episode 118 specifically on collective grief, but there's others in my archive which provide further support. You can access them through the podcast overview on my website. If you need support, check out the Support Yourself page on my website. It's also in the show notes. And get trauma-informed, grief-sensitive care. It's really important to look at trauma early on. Thank you for listening. And until next time, take gentle care of yourself and each other.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nathaliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.